Everyone is telling me that I need to go out and see the movie Wicked. I haven't done it yet, but it looks like a lot of you have, huh? Big thumbs up for Wicked. I believe it. I believe it because I saw the musical, and it was one of the most amazing things I'd ever seen. It's got to be one of the best out there. And the reason why you should see it, even if you've never heard of it before, is that it's the backstory to The Wizard of Oz. Isn't that a clever idea? It's the backstory. It explains what you need to know in order to understand everyone in The Wizard of Oz. When they first wrote The Wizard of Oz, they didn't know someone a century later was going to write a backstory to it. But the backstory says it all. Like, for example, the Good Witch and the Bad Witch, Glenda and Elzeba, they look like they couldn't be more further apart in The Wizard of Oz. But when you hear the backstory, you learn that they were actually college roommates. And there was a lot to the story between them. It teaches us a lesson that we need to know, which is that you can't judge a book by its cover, and you can't know everything about life from seeing it at face value. Shakespeare said, "What's past is prologue." That's true. The past is the prologue for what we're living now. We are a result now of all that's come before. Sometimes when we talk about our past, it can sound like we're using it as an excuse, and maybe some do. You know, the reason I'm like this is because of this. But the past is not an excuse, it's an explanation. It doesn't excuse things, it explains how we got to where we are in life. Because you can't understand everything by looking at the face of it. You have to know the backstory. A lot of us learn about the importance of knowing the backstory by making mistakes along the way. I don't know if you've ever done that, but I know a lot of what I use every day in my life as a priest comes from memories I have in the classroom from when I was a teacher. Because I made a lot of mistakes by looking at things only at face value. Like when I came down really hard on a certain student in my high school class for always being late, which was true. But what I didn't know is that he was being raised by a single mother with 3 jobs, and he had 3 younger siblings. He was the one, as the oldest, who had to get them up, feed them, and get them off to school before he could go to school. Or another kid who was acting just crazy for months on end. The whole spring was a nightmare with him. And when I finally had enough and let him know it, it was only after that I found out that this was going to be his first Mother's Day in May without his mom, who had died the summer before. You see, we have to learn that you can't know everything you need to know just by the face value of things. You have to look back a little further. One story of this is really hard to remember, and I wasn't even there. It was when a priest was filling in at my old parish. My former parish had a retired priest who's no longer alive, but he was filling in. And, you know, filling in is a hard job. You don't know where you are, and you don't know all the players. And this was a hard situation. He was celebrating Mass, and in the front pew was a kid playing on an iPad, the whole Mass, just playing on an iPad. And he looked to be about 13 or 14 years old. And so the priest is like, this kid should not be doing this during Mass. Where are the parents? And he realized that the mom was sitting right there next to him, very focused on the Mass. And he was really getting more and more irritated as he watched. Why isn't this mother directing her son to pay attention? This isn't right. And anyway, the tension built. Finally, it's almost time for the consecration, and he can't stand it anymore. And so he got down off the altar. He took the earbuds out of the kid's ear, and he said, "Stop ignoring God. Pay attention." And it was at that moment he realized immediately, by the kid's response, what the mom and everyone else in the church knew. He was a child who was dealing with profound autism. The only way he could be there is with those earbuds and that therapeutic tablet that he was using. Immediately, the priest knew his mistake, but it was too late. Can you imagine him going back up there shamefaced to the altar to do the consecration and the rest of Mass? But that's exactly what happened. We can't know the full scene that we're looking at unless we know the backstory. And we know that our Mother Mary dealt with this her whole life. Every Christmas, I learn something new about what it was like to be Mary and Joseph and the Holy Family. It's so interesting. You know, so often when you think you know the whole story, there's more backstory to know. Like, do you remember, jump ahead, 30 years after Christmas, Jesus comes back to his hometown and speaks at the synagogue for the first time, and everyone's like, whoa, wow, this guy's amazing. You probably remember the scene. And something that had gotten by me until this year, when I read a scripture scholar writing about it, is that when Jesus sat down and everyone was so impressed, it says in the scriptures that they turned to each other and said, wait a minute, how could this guy talk like that? Isn't he the son of Mary? Which I always took as just a benign little comment, but I know now it wasn't. That's not how they talked back then. They never said whose mother you had. They talked about your father. So they should have said, wait a minute, isn't this the son of Joseph? But they didn't. They said Mary, as a swipe at her 30 years later. Isn't this Mary's son? You know, you remember the angel and everything, supposedly? They were swiping at the dubious origin of Jesus' birth. They were taking a veiled hit at Mary all those years later because she still dealt with misunderstanding, because they didn't care enough about the backstory. So what we're having right now in this Advent, as we do every Advent, is 4 weeks of preparation for this incredible feast that we're about to celebrate, because we need to understand that the layers of meaning for all of the different parts of this story are infinite. They're far beyond our ability to ever take them all in. We could never fully understand all of God's motivations for this. And we're going to take our whole lifetime to understand just how courageous Mary's willingness to work with God was. This is another chance for us to see how easy it is to not fully understand this story and misjudge it, or to think we fully understand it and realize there are so many more riches within it that we need to uncover. Even as I was writing this very homily this week, I was in a coffee shop, and I was distracted at one point by a young man who was, in my opinion, taking up a lot of room and a lot of oxygen in the coffee shop. It wasn't a big deal, but he came in with a swagger, and he was kind of muscle-bound, and he was wearing a T-shirt that was a little bit aggressive in its theme. You know how sometimes you'll see that? And he didn't sit down the whole time. We're all sitting there at a pretty crowded coffee shop, and he was standing. And it just felt like, I wanted to just say, can you just sit down? I just, like, don't make this all about you, is some version of what I was thinking. And it was only at one point when he moved to the side a little bit that I could see that the reason he was standing there is because he was spoon-feeding breakfast to a profoundly disabled man in a motorized wheelchair. That's why he was standing there. And then as I watched him, I just could not believe how beautifully he was feeding this person, how tenderly, how much effort he was putting into every morsel, and how loving he was being with that person, joking with him, wiping his face, making him feel like the center of attention. I had totally misjudged him in just a little silent way, but right there, while I was working on this very homily. It's like that with everything. It's so easy to do, even with the Wicked Witch of the West, who we could think is only a bad character. and who we may need to take a second look at. You know, Wicked is a masterpiece, but it wasn't written by Shakespeare. It was written by Gregory Maguire from Albany. Did you know? He lives in Boston now, but no, he's from Albany. And he used to sing with me in the choir at St. Vincent de Paul. He actually has talked quite a bit about the inspiration for Wicked. He said, I'm an active practicing Catholic, and he said, I get to hear the scriptures at Mass every weekend, and there's always so many layers of meaning. It was hearing the stories from the scriptures at Mass that caused me to start thinking, I wonder what the deeper layers of meaning might be to other stories, like The Wizard of Oz. Gregory Maguire, not from Jerusalem or from Manhattan, but from Albany. He was the one that God chose, just a local kid, to teach this lesson to the whole world.